March 17, 1944. 3,000 feet above Rangoon, Burma. First Lieutenant Robert Hammond felt the B-24 Liberator shudder as Japanese Type 1 fighters opened fire from above, watching tracer rounds slice through the thin aluminum skin of his aircraft while 20mm cannon shells tore through the port wing fuel tank. He was 23 years old. Navigator. 7th Air Force, 493rd Bombardment Group. This was his 14th mission over Burma. The bomber carried 10 men and 4,000 pounds of ordnance targeting Japanese supply depots near the Irrawaddy River. Intelligence had promised minimal fighter resistance. The intelligence was wrong. The first burst hit the No. 3 engine. Oil sprayed across the wing. Black smoke streamed behind the aircraft. The pilot, Captain James Riley, fought to maintain altitude, but the B-24 was losing power. They were 40 miles behind Japanese lines, over dense jungle where no rescue would come. Hammond checked his watch. 14:27 hours. The second hand swept smoothly around the dial. It was a Hamilton pocket watch, converted to a wrist mount, given to him by his father before he shipped out. The inscription on the back read, "Time is the coin of your life. Spend it wisely." He had carried it on every mission. The aircraft lurched. Another fighter pass. This time the rounds punched through the fuselage, through the navigator's compartment, through equipment and charts and instruments. Hammond felt the impact before he felt the pain. Something slammed into his left arm, spinning him against the bulkhead. He looked down. Blood soaked through his leather jacket sleeve. A shell fragment had torn through his forearm. He pressed his right hand against the wound to slow the bleeding. The pain came in waves. He could feel bone grinding against bone when he moved his fingers. Broken. The arm was broken. But that was not the immediate problem. The immediate problem was the fire spreading through the port wing. Riley's voice came through the intercom, steady despite the circumstances. "We're going down. Prepare to bail out. Navigator, plot our position." Hammond pulled himself to the navigation table. His left arm was useless. He used his right hand to spread the chart, to check the compass heading, to calculate their position. They were 38 miles northwest of Rangoon, over the Pegu-Yoma mountain range. Jungle. No roads. No villages. Japanese-controlled territory. He marked the position, wrote the coordinates on a piece of paper, tucked it into his jacket pocket. Then he looked at his watch again. 14:31, 4 minutes since the attack began. The second hand still swept smoothly. Something about that steady movement calmed him. Time continued regardless of circumstance. The order came. Bail out. Bail out. Bail out. Hammond grabbed his parachute pack, clipped it to his harness with his functioning right hand. The other crew members were already moving toward the bomb bay, where the doors hung open showing empty sky and distant jungle below. He followed them, stepping over debris and shell casings and spilled hydraulic fluid. At the bomb bay, he hesitated. The wind screamed through the opening. The aircraft was in a shallow dive, losing altitude rapidly. Below, the jungle stretched endlessly in every direction, a solid carpet of green broken only by occasional ridgelines. No clearings. No open ground. Just trees. He jumped. The parachute deployed correctly. The opening shock jarred his broken arm. Pain shot through his shoulder and down to his wrist. He gritted his teeth, forced himself to breathe slowly. Above him, the B-24 continued its descent, trailing smoke and flame. He counted 6 other parachutes in the sky. 6 survivors out of 10. The bomber disappeared behind a ridgeline. Seconds later, a column of black smoke rose above the trees. Hammond looked at his watch. 14:34, 3 minutes since he jumped. The second hand continued its steady circle. He watched it for several seconds, using that constant rhythm to slow his breathing, to manage the pain, to prepare himself for what came next. The jungle rose up to meet him. He crashed through the canopy, branches whipping his face and tearing at his flight suit. His parachute caught in the upper branches. The risers jerked tight, stopping his fall 30 feet above the ground. He hung there, suspended, arm throbbing, surrounded by dense vegetation. He looked up. The parachute was thoroughly tangled. No way to climb down safely with one arm. He would have to cut himself free. He pulled his survival knife from his belt, reached up with his good arm, began sawing through the first riser. The nylon strands parted slowly. The second riser took longer. His arm was tiring. Sweat dripped into his eyes. The jungle around him was silent except for the sound of his knife working against the fabric. When the final strand parted, he dropped, fell through branches and leaves, hit the ground hard. The impact drove the air from his lungs. He lay still, waiting for his breathing to return, checking for new injuries. His left arm was worse. The fall had opened the wound further. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandage he had wrapped around it on the way down. But nothing else seemed broken. He stood slowly, using a tree trunk for support. The jungle floor was thick with undergrowth, ferns and vines and rotting vegetation. The canopy blocked most of the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight. He could barely see 20 feet in any direction. He checked his watch. 14:47, 13 minutes since bailout. The second hand still moved. Still steady. Still reliable. He adjusted the watch on his wrist, making sure it was secure. It had survived the jump, survived the crash through the canopy, survived the fall. It would continue to survive. The watch became his first reference point in the jungle. Everything else was unknown. Direction. Distance. Location. But time remained constant. The watch told him time was passing, that he was still alive, that he could measure his survival in minutes and hours. He began walking. Direction did not matter yet. First, he needed to find water. Second, he needed to treat his arm. Third, he needed to find other survivors. The jungle pressed in from all sides, making each step an effort. After 30 minutes, he found a stream. Small, shallow, running over rocks and through thick vegetation. He knelt beside it, unwrapped the bloody bandage from his arm, washed the wound in the cold water. The shell fragment had left a deep laceration along his forearm. The bone was definitely broken, he could feel the fracture when he probed carefully with his fingers. He tore strips from his parachute silk, fashioned a crude splint using sticks and fabric, wrapped it tight enough to immobilize the arm. The pain was constant, but manageable. He drank from the stream, filled his canteen, ate one of the emergency ration bars from his survival vest. Then he checked his watch. 15:23, 36 minutes since he found the stream. The second hand swept on. He wound the watch carefully, using only his right hand, feeling the tension in the mainspring as he turned the crown. The action was familiar, comforting. Something normal in an abnormal situation. He continued walking downstream, reasoning that water eventually led to larger rivers, that rivers meant settlements, that settlements meant people. Whether those people were friendly or hostile remained to be seen. The jungle grew denser. Vines hung from trees. Thorns caught on his flight suit. Insects swarmed around his face. The humidity was oppressive, making each breath feel like inhaling water. His broken arm throbbed with each heartbeat. At 1600 hours, he heard voices. Japanese. He froze, pressed himself against a tree trunk, tried to slow his breathing. The voices came from ahead, from the direction he had been walking. Multiple speakers. At least 3, possibly more. They were searching the area, calling to each other, moving through the jungle in a sweep pattern. Hammond backed away slowly, placing each foot carefully to avoid making noise. The Japanese were between him and the stream. He would have to find another water source. He turned east, or what he thought was east based on the position of the sun filtering through the canopy. For 2 hours, he moved through the jungle, stopping every few minutes to listen, checking his watch to measure the intervals. The Japanese voices faded behind him. At 1800 hours, he found another stream, smaller than the first. He refilled his canteen, rested for 15 minutes, then continued. Darkness came quickly in the jungle. One moment there was dim light, the next there was near total blackness. Hammond stopped walking. Moving at night would be suicide. He would get lost, injured, or both. He found a cluster of large trees, settled into the space between their roots, tried to make himself as comfortable as possible. He checked his watch. 19:15, the dial was luminous, designed for night navigation. The hands glowed faintly in the darkness. He watched the second hand complete one full revolution, then another. The steady movement was hypnotic, almost soothing. That night, he did not sleep. The jungle was alive with sounds. Animals moving through the undergrowth, birds calling from the canopy, insects buzzing near his face. Every sound could be danger. Japanese patrols. Wildlife. Snakes. He sat with his back against a tree, his survival knife in his right hand, watching the luminous dial of his watch mark the passing hours. 2100 hours, the sounds intensified. Something large moved through the brush nearby. He stayed motionless, barely breathing. The animal, whatever it was, passed without detecting him. 2300 hours, rain began falling, heavy tropical rain that turned the jungle floor to mud. He was soaked within minutes. The broken arm ached worse in the cold and wet. He pulled his flight jacket tighter, wrapped his arms around himself, shivered. 1 o'clock, the rain stopped. The jungle dripped and rustled. He checked the watch. The second hand continued its circuit. 5 hours until dawn. 5 hours to survive before he could move again. 3 o'clock, he heard screaming. Human screaming. Distant, to the south, carrying through the wet jungle air. The screams lasted for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. He knew what it meant. The Japanese had found one of the other survivors. He looked at his watch. 3:17, the second hand swept on, unconcerned with the horror happening miles away. He watched it complete another revolution, using its steady rhythm to push the screams from his mind. 5 o'clock, dawn light began filtering through the canopy. Hammond stood, his legs stiff from sitting all night, his arm worse than before. The wound was infected. He could see red streaks spreading from the laceration. He needed antibiotics, needed proper medical treatment. But that was impossible. He checked his watch. 5:23, the second hand moved. Time continued. He wound the watch again, feeling the mainspring tighten, then began walking. March 18, 1944. 6 o'clock hours. Hammond had been moving for 37 minutes when the watch stopped. Not suddenly. Not with a dramatic failure. The second hand simply slowed, hesitated, stopped at the 43-second mark. He tapped the crystal. Nothing. He wound the crown. The mainspring was tight, fully wound. But the second hand remained frozen. He stopped walking, stared at the motionless dial. For the first time since bailing out, something close to panic touched his mind. The watch had been his constant. His reference. His connection to a world where time meant something, where minutes could be measured and hours could be counted. Now it was broken. He examined it carefully. The crystal was intact. The hands were undamaged. The case showed no new dents or scratches beyond those it had accumulated over 14 missions. Something internal had failed. A gear, a spring, a pivot. Something small and essential that he could not see or fix. He tried winding it again, hoping the mechanism would somehow restart. The crown turned, the mainspring tightened, but the second hand did not move. The time frozen on the dial read 6 hours 43 minutes and 43 seconds. That would be the last accurate time he would know. Hammond sat down on a fallen log, still holding the watch in his right hand. His broken left arm throbbed. The infection was spreading. Fever was building. Without the watch, he had no way to measure his progress, no way to estimate how long until sunset, no way to calculate distance traveled. The jungle had taken his aircraft, his crew, his direction. Now it had taken his time. He sat there for several minutes, or perhaps it was an hour. Without the watch, he could not tell. The sun moved slowly through the canopy. Birds called. Insects buzzed. The jungle continued regardless of whether he could measure it. Then something changed in his mind. A shift in perspective that came from fever or exhaustion or simple acceptance. The watch was broken. But it still existed. It still hung on his wrist. The frozen hand still pointed to 6:43. It was still his father's watch, still carried the inscription on the back, "Time is the coin of your life. Spend it wisely." He looked at the motionless second hand. For 24 hours, he had measured his survival by that hand's movement. 30 minutes to find water. 2 hours to evade the Japanese. 5 hours until dawn. Time had been something external, something the watch provided. But time had not stopped. Only its measurement had stopped. Hammond stood, adjusted the broken watch on his wrist, began walking again. The sun's position told him it was morning. His shadow told him which direction was roughly east. His thirst told him when he needed water. His exhaustion told him when he needed rest. The watch had not measured these things. His body had. His mind had. He had simply used the watch to confirm what he already knew. By midday, he reached a ridge overlooking a valley. Below, he could see a river, larger than the streams he had been following. And beside the river, a village. Small, perhaps 20 buildings, surrounded by rice paddies. Smoke rose from cooking fires. He could not tell if the village was Japanese-controlled or Burmese. Could not tell if going there would mean rescue or capture. The broken watch offered no guidance. He would have to decide without knowing the time, without knowing how long he had been walking, without knowing how many hours of daylight remained. He descended into the valley, moving carefully, stopping frequently to observe the village. No Japanese soldiers visible. No military vehicles. Just farmers working in the fields, children playing near the buildings, women carrying water from the river. At 50 yards from the village, he stopped. Made his decision. Stepped into the open. A child saw him first. A boy, perhaps 10 years old, who dropped the stick he was carrying and ran toward the buildings shouting. Adults emerged from doorways. Hammond raised his right hand, palm forward, the universal gesture of peace. His left arm hung useless in its crude splint. An elderly man approached, walking slowly, studying Hammond's flight suit and injured arm. He spoke in Burmese. Hammond shook his head, tried English. American. Pilot. Need help. The elderly man nodded, seemed to understand. He gestured toward one of the buildings, called to the other villagers. Several men came forward, helped Hammond walk to the building, sat him on a wooden bench. A woman brought water. He drank. Another woman brought rice wrapped in banana leaves. He ate. The elderly man examined his arm, shaking his head at the infected wound, the crude splint, the fever-bright eyes. Then the man did something unexpected. He reached for Hammond's wrist, looked at the broken watch, studied the frozen hands. He tapped the crystal, held the watch to his ear, listened to the silence. Then he nodded, as if this confirmed something he had suspected. He spoke to one of the younger men, who left the building and returned several minutes later with a small wooden box. The elderly man opened the box, revealing an assortment of tools. Watchmaker's tools. Tiny screwdrivers, tweezers, magnifying glass. The man gestured to the watch, then to himself. Hammond understood. He carefully removed the watch from his wrist, handed it to the elderly man, who carried it to a table near the window where the light was better. For the next hour, Hammond sat and watched as the elderly man worked on the watch. The old man removed the case back with a small knife, exposing the movement inside. He used the magnifying glass to examine the gears and springs, probed delicately with the tweezers, muttered to himself in Burmese. At one point, he found the problem. A tiny hairspring, barely visible, had come loose from its mounting. He worked for several minutes, using tools smaller than Hammond had ever seen, reattaching the hairspring to its proper position. Then he reassembled the watch, wound it carefully, held it to his ear. A smile crossed his face. He handed the watch back to Hammond. The second hand was moving again. Sweeping smoothly around the dial. Measuring time. Hammond stared at it, watching the hand complete one full revolution, then another. The watch worked. The old man had fixed it. But something had changed. During the hour without the watch, during the hour when time existed only in his body's needs and the sun's position, Hammond had learned something. The watch measured time, but it did not create time. Time existed whether measured or not. Survival did not depend on knowing the exact hour. Survival depended on responding to immediate needs. The watch was a tool. Useful. Valuable. But not essential. He looked at the elderly man, bowed his head in thanks. The man bowed back, then gestured to Hammond's injured arm. Another villager brought clean water and cloth strips. A woman produced a clay jar containing some kind of paste, green and pungent-smelling. They unwrapped Hammond's crude splint, cleaned the infected wound with water and cloth, applied the green paste liberally to the laceration, fashioned a proper splint from bamboo and clean fabric, bound it tightly. The elderly man spoke again in Burmese, gesturing to the east, then to Hammond, then to the floor. Hammond understood. Stay here. Rest. Sleep. The villagers would keep him safe. He checked his watch. The repaired watch. The working watch. It read 14:23. 7.5 hours since it had stopped. 7.5 hours during which he had survived without it, had navigated without it, had made decisions without it. The watch told him it was afternoon. His body had already known this from the heat and the sun's position. The watch told him he was exhausted. His body had already known this from the trembling in his legs and the fog in his mind. The watch was no longer his only reference. It was simply one tool among many. That night, he slept on a woven mat in a village building, surrounded by people who did not speak his language but who had chosen to help him. Before sleeping, he looked at his watch. 21:15, the second hand swept on. But this time, he did not watch it for comfort. He simply noted the time, then closed his eyes. Time would continue whether he watched it or not. March 19, 1944. 5:30 hours according to the watch. Hammond woke to the sound of voices outside the building. Urgent voices. The elderly man entered, spoke rapidly in Burmese, gestured to the east. Hammond did not need translation. Japanese. Coming from the east. The village had to evacuate. He stood, tested his injured arm. The infection was better. The fever had broken during the night. The green paste had worked. His arm was still broken, but the pain was manageable. The villagers were packing quickly. Women gathered children and bundles of food. Men collected tools and valuables. The elderly man approached Hammond, pointed to the west, to the mountains visible in the distance. Hammond understood. The village was moving to the mountains. He could come with them. He checked his watch. 5:47, the Japanese were perhaps an hour away, perhaps two. Without the watch, he would have guessed the same based on the urgency in the villagers' movements, the speed of their preparations. By 6:30, the village was empty. 37 people, including Hammond, moved in a column toward the west. The elderly man led, followed by the able-bodied adults, then the children, then the elderly. Hammond walked in the middle of the column, his broken arm supported by the splint, his flight suit standing out among the villagers' simple clothing. They followed a trail that led upward through the jungle, through clearings and over streams, always climbing. The pace was quick but sustainable. The children did not complain. The elderly kept up without assistance. These people had fled before, Hammond realized. They knew how to move, how to cover ground, how to survive. At 9 o'clock, they heard the first sounds of the Japanese in the valley below. Shouts. Gunfire. The sound of buildings being searched and destroyed. The column did not stop. The elderly man increased the pace slightly. By noon, they were high in the mountains, following a narrow trail along a ridge. Below, the valley stretched out, hazy in the tropical heat. Hammond could see smoke rising from where the village had been. The elderly man called a halt. The villagers gathered in a clearing, shared water and rice, rested for 30 minutes. Hammond checked his watch, then realized he was using it differently now. Before, he had checked it constantly, measuring every interval, counting every minute. Now, he checked it only when relevant. To mark significant events. To estimate the distance traveled. To plan the next stage of the journey. The watch had become what it was meant to be. A tool. Not a lifeline. They continued until 1600 hours, then stopped for the day in another clearing, this one with a small spring providing water. The villagers set up a temporary camp, using woven mats and bamboo poles to create simple shelters. Hammond helped as best he could with one functional arm. That evening, the elderly man approached him with the wooden box of watchmaker's tools. Through gestures and a few words of broken English, he explained that he had learned the trade from his father, who had learned it from a British missionary in Rangoon before the war. The man opened the box, showed Hammond each tool, explained its purpose through pantomime. The tiny screwdrivers for case backs. The tweezers for handling springs. The magnifying glass for examining movements. The oil for lubricating pivots. Then he gestured to Hammond's watch, to the second hand sweeping smoothly, and made a braking motion. Pointed to himself. Made a fixing motion. Hammond understood. The watch would break again. When it did, the old man could fix it again. But something else was happening in this exchange. The old man was teaching Hammond to see the watch differently. Not as a magical object that measured time, but as a machine composed of parts that could fail and could be repaired. The watch was mechanical. Understandable. Fixable. Hammond removed the watch, handed it to the elderly man, who opened the case back again and showed Hammond the movement inside. Pointed to the balance wheel oscillating back and forth. To the escape wheel advancing in tiny increments. To the mainspring slowly unwinding. The second hand's movement was not magic. It was mechanics. Gears and springs and pivots working together in precise sequence. When the hairspring had come loose, the sequence had stopped. When the hairspring was reattached, the sequence resumed. Time itself was like this, Hammond realized. Not magical. Not external. Just a sequence of events following one another. Dawn following night. Hunger following exertion. Rest following exhaustion. The watch measured this sequence, but the sequence existed independently of the measurement. He thanked the elderly man, accepted the watch back, strapped it to his wrist. The second hand continued its sweep. But now he understood what he was seeing. A mechanism. A tool. A way of organizing events into a measurable sequence. That night, lying on his mat in the temporary shelter, he listened to the jungle sounds and thought about the past 3 days. The bailout. The crash landing. The night in the jungle. The village. The evacuation. All of it had happened in sequence. The watch had measured the sequence, but the sequence would have happened regardless. Tomorrow, they would continue west. The watch would measure the journey. But the journey would happen whether measured or not. He checked the watch one final time before sleeping. 22:37, the second hand swept on. A mechanism doing what mechanisms do. Measuring what could be measured. Leaving unmeasured what could not be measured. March 20th through April 2nd, 1944. 14 days of walking, hiding, climbing, descending. The villagers knew the trails, knew where to find water, knew how to avoid Japanese patrols. Hammond followed, his broken arm healing slowly, his strength returning. He checked his watch less frequently now. Morning. Noon. Evening. Night. The major transitions were enough. The exact minutes did not matter in the jungle. What mattered was reading the environment, responding to immediate needs, maintaining the pace the villagers set. On March 27th, they reached a larger settlement in the mountains. A Karen village of perhaps 200 people, hidden in a valley surrounded by peaks. The elderly man spoke with the village leaders, gestured to Hammond, explained the situation. The Karen had a radio. British radio, operated by a resistance fighter who coordinated with Allied forces in India. That night, Hammond sent his first message since bailout. Position. Condition. Request for extraction. The response came 2 days later. A British liaison officer would arrive within the week to evaluate extraction options. Hammond should wait at the village. During those days, he helped the villagers. One-armed labor, but useful. Carrying water. Moving supplies. Teaching English words to the children who gathered around him, fascinated by his flight suit and his stories. The elderly watchmaker stayed with him, continued to check the watch daily, showed Hammond how to clean the movement, how to oil the pivots, how to adjust the regulation if the watch ran too fast or too slow. The watch became a shared project. Teacher and student. Knowledge transferred across language barriers through gesture and demonstration and patience. Hammond learned that the watch was not just a timepiece but a lesson in precision, in patience, in the importance of small things working together to create something larger. On April 2nd, the British liaison officer arrived. Captain David Morrison, Special Operations Executive, working with Karen resistance groups behind Japanese lines. He examined Hammond's arm, his condition, his papers. "You're the navigator from the B-24 that went down on March 17, Morrison said. "Yes. You were listed as missing, presumed dead. The Japanese reported capturing 2 of your crew. The others weren't found." Hammond absorbed this information. Out of 10 men, only 3 survived. Him and 2 who were now prisoners. "There's an extraction route," Morrison continued. "For days walk to a landing zone where a light aircraft can pick you up. Weather permitting. Can you travel?" Hammond looked at his broken arm, now properly healed, though the bone would need surgery eventually. Looked at the villagers who had saved him, hidden him, taught him. Looked at his watch. 14:23, the second hand sweeping. "Yes. I can travel." The elderly watchmaker approached before Hammond left. Handed him the wooden box of watchmaker's tools. Spoke in Burmese, gestured to the watch, to Hammond, to the future. The message was clear. Keep the tools. Maintain the watch. Remember the lessons. Hammond tried to refuse. The tools were valuable, irreplaceable. But the old man insisted, pressed the box into Hammond's hand, smiled, bowed. Hammond bowed back. Checked his watch. 1500 hours, time to leave. The journey to the extraction point took 6 days, not 4. Weather. Japanese patrols. Difficult terrain. Morrison led, Hammond followed, and on April 8, they reached the landing zone. A short grass strip in a mountain valley. The aircraft arrived at 11 o'clock hours according to Hammond's watch. A small liaison plane, barely large enough for 2 passengers and a pilot. Morrison went first, would continue his work with the resistance. Hammond went second, would return to India, to medical treatment, to debriefing. As the aircraft climbed over the mountains, Hammond looked at the watch on his wrist. The second hand swept smoothly. Gears and springs and pivots working together, measuring the sequence of events that was time. But the watch was no longer his only reference. He had learned to read the sun, the stars, his body's needs, the environment's changes. The watch supplemented this knowledge, provided precision, but did not replace understanding. Time was not something external that the watch provided. Time was the sequence of events. The watch just measured the sequence. The aircraft flew west, toward the Allied lines, toward safety, toward whatever came next. Hammond checked his watch periodically. Not constantly. Not compulsively. Just periodically. A tool being used as tools should be used. At the air base in India, they removed him from the aircraft, put him in an ambulance, drove him to the field hospital. Doctors examined his arm, said the bone had healed incorrectly, would need to be rebroken and set properly. Surgery scheduled for tomorrow. He checked his watch. 17:23, the second hand swept on. That evening, in the hospital bed, he removed the watch from his wrist for the first time since the bailout. 23 days. The watch had measured all of them, except for the 7 hours when it was broken. He opened the case back using one of the elderly watchmaker's tools, looked at the movement inside. The balance wheel oscillating. The gears turning. The hairspring that had come loose and been repaired now firmly in place. A nurse entered, saw what he was doing. Checking the time, she asked. No, Hammond said. Just checking the mechanism. He reassembled the watch, wound it carefully, set it based on the clock on the hospital wall. The watch was 3 minutes slow after 23 days. Not bad for what it had been through. He strapped it back on his wrist. The second hand resumed its sweep. Measuring time. But he no longer needed to watch it sweep to know that time was passing. Time would pass whether measured or not. Events would sequence themselves whether counted or not. Survival depended not on precise measurement, but on reading the environment, responding to needs, making decisions with incomplete information. The watch had taught him this by breaking. By stopping. By forcing him to continue without it. And in continuing without it, he had learned that the watch was never his only hope. He was his own hope. His body. His mind. His ability to adapt and survive and keep moving through whatever sequence of events came next. The watch just measured the sequence. He lived it. April 1945. 1 year later. Hammond had returned to flight status after his arm healed, flew another 23 missions over Burma before the war in Asia ended. He carried the watch on every mission, but he checked it differently now. Not as a lifeline, but as a tool. After the war, he returned to Ohio, to his father's watch shop, to a life of repairing timepieces and teaching customers the same lessons the elderly Burmese watchmaker had taught him in the jungle. That watches were machines. That time was a sequence. That survival came not from measuring events precisely, but from responding to them appropriately. The watch on his wrist still worked, still swept its second hand around the dial, still measured the passing hours. The inscription on the back still read, "Time is the coin of your life. Spend it wisely." But Hammond had learned that wisdom was not about counting every second. Wisdom was about recognizing what mattered and what did not. About understanding that time would continue whether you measured it or not. About knowing that survival often meant trusting yourself more than your instruments. In 1963, during a reunion of the 493rd Bombardment Group, he met the families of the crew members who had not survived the bailout over Burma. He told them about the watch, about the village, about the sequence of events that had led him through the jungle and back to Allied lines. One of the widows asked if he still wore the watch. He showed her his wrist. The same watch. Still working. Still measuring time. Still sweeping its second hand around the dial. "It stopped once," he said. "For 7 hours in the jungle. When it stopped, I thought I had lost everything. But I learned I had lost nothing essential. Time was still passing. I was still alive. The watch just confirmed what I already knew." He wound the watch carefully, the way the elderly watchmaker had taught him. The way he had taught his own children. The way he would teach his grandchildren. Time is the coin of your life. Spend it wisely. Not by counting every second. But by recognizing which seconds matter. The watch measured time. But Hammond had learned to measure himself. His strengths. His limitations. His ability to continue when the measurements stopped. That was the lesson the broken watch had taught him. That survival came not from perfect measurement, but from continuing when measurement became impossible. From trusting yourself when the instruments failed. From knowing that time would continue whether you could count it or not. The second hand swept on. The watch kept working. The sequence continued. As it always had. As it always would. Whether measured or not.